Hello and welcome to worship. I'd like to invite you to center yourself in God's love with this song. Come and find the quiet center in the crowded life we lead. Find the room for hope to enter. Find the frame where we are freed. Clear the chaos and the clutter. Clear our eyes that we can see all the things that really matter. Be at peace and simply be. Taking a deep breath. So a month ago, while I was driving to church, I saw a sight that you just don't see every day. A woman was riding a horse down my road, followed by another horse carrying a whole mountain of gear. I wondered who this person was and what her story was. Well, by the time I got back from church, that little caravan was at my home, resting near the pond, so I got the whole story. This lady was on a long journey, planning to ride all summer and into the fall, from California to Colorado. I know. The trouble was her horses were heavily burdened by so much gear, and they were only able to cover about half the distance she had planned for each day. At that rate, they would never get to Colorado before winter, and she had some serious thinking to do. She decided to rest her horses for a couple days while she regrouped and assessed the situation, and that is when she realized that her pack mare had an injury which prevented her from carrying the gear. That burden was just too heavy for the horse. But so was the burden of expectations carried by the rider. Should she give up on the whole trip and disappoint everyone who was rooting for her? She just couldn't do that. She considered getting a new horse and going on without her beloved mare, but she couldn't do that either. They were a team. Now, there was no shortage of outside opinion on what she should do. Everyone who heard her story, of course, had feelings about what was the right course of action. But all of those voices just saddled this traveler with too much heavy baggage. In the end, she had to remove the burden of other people's expectations and do what was right for her. Jesus knew all about this. You see, everywhere he went, he heard about how many things he did wrong. People are hard to please, you know that. Whenever Jesus ate and drank at a feast, people said he was a glutton and a drunk. They were so judgy. But those same people accused his cousin John of having some sort of demon because he ate little and drank nothing. Jesus recognized that no matter what choices he or any of his followers made, they would be judged by the folks who expected them to do things their way. He even said, half jokingly, "But to what will I compare this generation? It is like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another, 'We played the flute for you and you didn't dance. We wailed and you didn't mourn.' For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds." Jesus had wisdom that went much, much deeper than the so-called wisdom of those who wanted to impose their harsh judgments on his life. He recognized that while their intentions may have been good, his critics were weirdly obsessed with following a host of cumbersome rules, burdening themselves and others with all sorts of religious baggage that really didn't help them on their spiritual journey of walking humbly in God's path of love. Now, Jesus was not implying that their religion was bad. Theirs was his religion too. But he recognized that many people were carrying burdens that were simply not required by God. What God did require of them was love. Love of God, love of neighbor. All the laws and prophetic teachings boil down to those two things, according to Jesus. And any requirements that didn't apply directly to love of God and neighbor, they were just heavy burdens. And this is what Jesus said about that. I'm in Matthew chapter 10, by the way. Chapter 11. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I have met people who have given up entirely on religion because the burden felt too heavy. People who were told they had to believe this and do that, and denounce this and refrain from doing that, or else they could not call themselves part of the faith community, and those expectations were just too heavy for people who found they had questions. What if they could not simply accept every single teaching on faith alone? What if they had doubt? Now, in some religious spaces, doubt is perfectly acceptable and questions are welcomed. But in some spaces, that's not the case. The burden to accept everything without question, to follow the teachings of one leader or one institution, even if they conflict with one's own inner knowing or one's understanding of Jesus' actual teaching, what then? Must one simply walk away from the whole thing? Some people do. Others choose this alternative, to continue staggering along underneath that burden of do's and don'ts until they break. Now, I've seen people choose that path too, often becoming bitter and angry from carrying the burden of religious expectations that never help them find the joy of living into their own blessedness. Those people often turn out angry, and understandably so. They've shouldered the yoke of those rules for so long, they just cannot stand to see anyone taking a lighter load. I was dressed down severely once after a funeral by someone who was so mad that I had not taken advantage of this captive audience and preached judgment and hellfire. In the opinion of that unhappy individual, that should have been the entire point of the funeral, to cast his heavy doctrine of fear-based theology upon everyone else. Now, I happen to have a very different theology, but that was impossible for this one to understand after years of being shaped by heavy beliefs. The thing is, there just is not a one-size-fits-all way to do religion. The spiritual practice is meaningful to me, might not resonate with you, but I'm not going to judge you for it. Or maybe you and I hear some of the same stories and understand them differently. One of us might call history what the other hears as poetry. And that is all right. We do not have to be of the same mind to love the same God or to love each other. And when it comes down to it, those are the two things that matter. Our God requires mercy, kindness, and humility, qualities that Jesus embodied and tried to pass along to his followers. It does behoove us to remember this each time we find ourselves maybe laying our expectations on one another, because how do I know that my way is the only way and the best one for you? I may choose to fast during Lent, but if you don't, then far be it for me to scorn you for eating your fill. If you are doing all the good you possibly can, and if your words and actions harm no one, then who am I to judge you? That's God's business, not mine. Now, that is not to say that following Jesus is easy. His path is difficult. It involves a certain amount of sacrifice. The ego has to go, for one thing. It's hard to give up. We have to be willing to reach out to others with kindness and humility, and we must master the art of forgiveness and acceptance, even when people push us to our limits, and they will. We have to learn to see others as God sees people, and we must speak out against injustice and stand up for mercy. That's not only difficult, it's risky. We know what happens to those who speak truth to power. Gandhi, Mandela, King, Jesus himself, the prophet's reward, Jesus called it. For him, it was a cross. Jesus' path was not easy street, and he wasn't trying to convince anyone that it was, but following Jesus' path does not mean carrying extra baggage you don't need. You do have Jesus' permission to lay down the heavy burdens of what others tell you is required for you to be acceptable in God's eyes. If Jesus could look at a ragtag group of fishermen and fiends, just as flawed and foolish as they could possibly be, and if he could love them, then he can look at you too and love you. Whoever you are, however you are, whatever people say you are or aren't, you are beloved to God. You don't need the baggage of anyone telling you any differently. Lay that burden down. So I never told you what happened with the woman and her horses, did I? Well, what she decided to do was to continue the journey with her two horses, keeping her team together, but she made some significant modifications. First, she lightened the load, dropping most of her gear so that one horse could carry everything, including her. The injured horse was relieved of its burden entirely and could get back on the trail bearing nothing but its own weight. She also modified her route and itinerary so that she could accept more help and support along the way. She would not give up on the journey entirely, nor would she burden herself or her horses with unrealistic expectations that would only break everyone down. And that, my friends, is the essence of what Jesus called spiritual wisdom. I do wish that I could have had my new friend, the horseback rider, tell you her story in her own words, but she needed to get back on the trail and there was just no holding her back. I wish her happy trails and a safe journey, and I wish the same for you. May your burdens be light, and may you know only the joy and the peace of being beloved to God and to this community of those who follow Jesus' way the best we know how. This would be my prayer for you today. May you run and not be weary, may your heart be filled with song, and may the love of God continue to give you hope and keep you strong. And may you run and not be weary, may your life be filled with joy, and may the road you travel always lead you home. Blessings on your journey, my beloved friend.